The savannah air was always thick and humid, as if soaked with the history of this small town. I sat on the porch of my house with a cup of lemon tea, watching the evening sun paint the horizon with golden hues. Here, in my house on the outskirts, the days stretched on slowly, and the nights were quieter than I could bear. 5 years ago, I lost my husband. He had been my anchor, my light, and when he was gone, I had to relearn how to live. It turned out to be harder than I thought. Our children had grown up and moved away, living their own lives. I was left alone with a house that felt more like an echo than a home. But recently, my routine changed. A kitten, a ginger one with white paws, had wandered into my yard. Max. That's what I named him. He became my loyal companion, a shadow that was always near. Max was bold and curious, as all young creatures are. He loved to leap onto the windowsill, climb the chairs, and bring me mice, which I never knew how to dispose of without hurting his feelings. That evening, Max was curled up beside me when I first noticed Jake. A young man in his early 20s, he was renting the house across the street. His light pickup truck was parked near the driveway, and he was busy watering flowers. Jake, as I later learned, worked at a local garage, was friendly, and always smiled whenever we crossed paths. I watched him through the swaying branches of an oak tree. He was nothing like the people who usually lived in our neighborhood. His youth and energy contrasted sharply with my quiet, measured life. Sensing my interest, Max suddenly leaped off the chair and ran toward the road. "Max! Come back!" I called, standing up. But my little rascal had already reached his target. He easily jumped onto the hood of Jake's truck and then made his way to Jake himself. I hurried after him, trying not to look too flustered. "This kitten's quite the explorer," Jake said, picking Max up in his arms. His smile was disarming warm. "I'm sorry, he's always looking for adventures," I replied, reaching out to take Max. "Don't worry, he's funny." "You've got a good friend here," he noted, stroking Max before handing him back to me. Our eyes met, and I felt a strange warmth. Seconds stretched longer than usual. I muttered something like, "Thank you," and quickly returned home. Max purred in my arms, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But I couldn't stop thinking about how that brief moment had suddenly made the day feel less lonely. When I got back home, the world was as quiet as ever. But something had changed. And it wasn't just Max. After Max betrayed my curiosity, I couldn't stop thinking about Jake. His kind smile, his easy manner of speaking, it all lingered unexpectedly in my thoughts. Over the next week, I tried avoiding the porch during the times he might be outside. Even Max seemed to sense the shift, spending more time on the windowsill, staring at the house across the street. One evening, when the heat finally gave way to a cool breeze, I noticed that the lamp in my living room had stopped working. It was probably just a burnout bulb, but I had no idea how to fix it. Jake had mentioned he was handy with such things, and after a moment of hesitation, I picked up the phone and dialed his number. "Jake, it's Claire," I began, trying to sound calm. "Sorry to bother you, but I've got a little problem with a lamp. Could you take a look if you have time?" He arrived faster than I expected, tools in hand and a broad smile on his face. Max, as usual, was the first to greet him. "Where's this lamp, Miss Claire?" he asked as he stepped inside. "Please, just Claire," I corrected him, trying not to show my nervousness. As he worked on the wires, I couldn't help but notice how natural he looked in my home. As if he had always belonged here. We talked about small things, the heat of the summer, his work at the garage. I learned that he dreamed of starting his own business, doing what he loved on his terms. "You're very confident," I said, looking at him. "At your age, I was only just beginning to figure out what I wanted from life." He looked up and replied, "Confidence comes from being around good people. People like you, for example, give me a reason to believe anything's possible." I didn't know what to say. His words were so sincere that I had to turn away to hide my embarrassment. When the lamp finally worked, he stepped closer to me, brushing off an imaginary speck of dust from my blouse. The gesture was so unexpected that I froze. "Thank you, Jake," I said quietly, feeling the silence between us grow thicker. "You're welcome," he replied, but his voice was softer now, lower. We stood so close I could see every freckle on his face. I don't know what came over me, but my lips formed his name before I could stop myself. He looked into my eyes, and before I knew it, he leaned in and touched his lips to mine. It was soft, a brief kiss, tentative like the first step on thin ice. "I'm sorry," he whispered, pulling back. "You don't need to be," I replied, feeling my heart race. And yet, we both knew that moment had changed something. Jake left a few minutes later, and I was left sitting in the silence that no longer felt so oppressive. After that evening, I avoided Jake. Perhaps it was a weakness of mine, but everything I knew about life screamed, "This is wrong." I was 58, and he was only 23. The age difference wasn't just a number. It was a chasm of experiences, dreams, and fears. And yet, every time I saw his house through the window, I found myself thinking about his gaze, his voice, his touch. Max, sensing my inner turmoil, spent more time with me in the garden. Gardening had always been my refuge. Pulling weeds, trimming branches, planting new flowers, it gave me the feeling that I had control over something in this world. But even amidst the scent of fresh soil and the chatter of birds, I couldn't shake thoughts of Jake. One Saturday, armed with a spade and gloves, I decided to transplant my roses. The sun hung high in the sky, bathing everything in a soft, warm light. Max lazily sprawled on the path, watching me work. I was about to head back to the house for some water when I heard his voice. "Claire, need some help?" I turned and my heart skipped a beat. Jake stood at the gate with a box in his hands. Inside the box were young seedlings. He walked closer, and I noticed his t-shirt was slightly smudged with dirt. He'd probably been working in his own yard. "I thought these plants might do better in your garden. They didn't take to mine, and everything seems to thrive here," he explained, setting the box down. "Thank you, but I can handle it," I said, feeling my face flush slightly. "Let me help," he insisted. Who says no to an extra pair of hands? Before I could protest, he grabbed a pair of gloves from the table and started digging. Soon we were working side by side, planting the new flowers. Max darted around us, trying to steal a glove or jump into the holes we were digging. I began to relax. We talked about trivial things: the weather, his childhood, how he used to spend summers in the countryside with his grandmother. He shared how he loved running barefoot through the fields and dreamed of one day having a house with a large garden of his own. "You know, Claire," he said, pausing for a moment, "your garden, it's like a reflection of you. Beautiful, well-tended, but a little guarded. You've poured so much of yourself into it." I looked at him, trying to understand what he meant. But before I could respond, he gently touched my hand. The gesture was so simple, yet it conveyed more than words ever could. Everything happened so quickly. I stepped closer, and suddenly there was barely any space between us. Jake leaned in, his eyes searching mine for permission, and in that moment I allowed myself to respond. His lips touched mine softly, as if testing whether I would pull away. The kiss was brief but filled with something I couldn't quite explain, a mix of tenderness, respect, and something deeper. When we parted, he stepped back slightly, as if to make sure he hadn't broken something precious. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice trembling. "For what?" he asked. "For reminding me that I can still feel." We continued working in the garden as if nothing had happened, but the air between us had changed. The garden bloomed, and with it, so did I. Since that day in the garden, so much had changed, even though everything outwardly remained the same. The neighborhood houses stood as they always had, the sun rose and set, and Max still leapt between the bushes like the little king of the yard. But something within me had shifted. I tried to keep my distance, not because I was afraid of Jake, but because I was afraid of myself. That kiss had opened a door I'd kept closed for years. A desire to be alive again, to feel again, to be seen by someone. But I couldn't ignore the glaring reality of our age difference. One evening, as twilight blanketed the neighborhood, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea. Max purred at my feet as I gazed at the glowing windows of Jake's house. Suddenly, the gate creaked and I saw his silhouette. "May I sit?" he asked, motioning to the chair beside me. "Of course," I replied, surprised by his unexpected visit. Jake sat down, and for a few minutes we simply sat in silence. It was a comfortable silence, almost soothing. He held a small flower pot with a young rose sapling inside. "I thought your garden could use one more flower," he said, handing me the pot. I smiled, accepting the gift. Thank you. I'll find the perfect spot for it. He sighed, leaning forward as if searching for the right words. Claire, I know you probably think this is all wrong. But for me, you're something special. I lowered my gaze to my hands, feeling my heart race. Jake, you're a wonderful person. But I can't. I shouldn't let myself do this. Why? He asked gently. Because we're from different worlds, I said, finally finding the courage to speak. And I don't want you to regret this when you're older. He looked at me with understanding, but there was a stubborn resolve in his eyes. I'd never regret it. But I respect you, Claire. So if you feel this is wrong, I'll accept that. We fell silent again. Max jumped onto Jake's lap, and he began stroking him absent-mindedly. Sometimes what's right and wrong is just what we tell ourselves, he said softly, looking into the distance. When he left, I sat on the porch for a long time. His words echoed in my mind, but I knew my decision was the right one. Jake was young, full of life, and I didn't want to stand in his way. The next morning, I planted the rose at the very center of the garden. Its delicate petals glistened in the sunlight, promising to grow into something beautiful. Weeks passed. Jake moved away, saying he had found a job in another town. I saw him off with a mix of sadness and peace. We had left that moment as it was, beautiful, unspoken, but right. Now, my garden is more vibrant than ever, and Max still leaps among the flowers. As I sit on my porch, I feel that life goes on. It doesn't always give us what we want, but it always gives us what we need.